Good morning, everyone. Thank you for um, joining us this morning in this Module 6 of the Seeding Success series. Today we're going to talk about um, something that's can be very confusing for many people, no matter what level you are, and that's scholarship and extension. What does that look like? Whether it leads to tenure or promotion or just is an expectation of your position regardless. It's something that we thought was important, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some questions or get some discussion going. My name is Janine Creighton, and I'm an associate professor and extension specialist here at the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. I welcome my panelists today, which you'll get to know a little bit better in just a moment. But Lisa Hickey, Sustainable Food Systems Extension Agent 2 for Manatee County at University of Florida Extension. Mark McGallis, Extension Professor, Forestry Resources at NC State University. And Andy Londo, Professor, Assistant Extension Director, and Ag and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University. Not to be confused with the other OSUs out there, of which there are many. All right. But before we begin, I want to thank the team of folks that I met with early on in this process to kind of go over what kind of content was going to be important for this particular topic. And those folks that helped me out way back when, Martha Monroe from University of Florida, Andy Londo from The Ohio State University with us joining us again today, and Randy Brooks from the University of Idaho. So thanks very much to these colleagues for working with me in the initial stages of helping to determine what kind of information do we think is important for people. What do they need to know? All right. Before we get, actually, I want to go one ahead. No, let's go back. Before we get started with talking with folks, I have some clips from a YouTube, and these were interviews that were done at the ANRET meeting, and I pulled out a few snippets of some folks talking about promotion and tenure in extension and scholarship and what that looks like. And I just wanted to play, it's a little bit about 8 minutes worth, and hopefully this will work.
So promotion and tenure, it's interesting. So it varies so much by state, especially when it comes to extension, because extension is handled differently in different states, and in some cases the promotion and tenure tracks for people that work in the field faculty or field extension agents might differ from what would be required for a statewide specialist, perhaps working in a department on the main campus. So there is a lot of variability state to state. My experience is mostly within Virginia and Oregon, and I would say both of those states are somewhat similar in regards to how promotion and tenure is viewed, particularly for the statewide specialists. So coming on for a new person, it's really important to identify what's expected, what's in the position description, and more particularly what the department and perhaps the college and the extension service are looking for. One of the best tips I could give would be to find some other extension specialists, whether they're in your college or perhaps another one who've been successful through the system, and buy them a cup of coffee, talk with them. In some cases, maybe even create a mentor-mentee relationship with them, because those are the folks that have been successful where you are, and that's probably the most important thing. Having a good relationship with the department head and the other decision makers up the chain is always good, making sure that they know and understand what it is that you're doing. Don't just take your job and go off and come back 5 years later or 6 years later and apply for tenure. It's really good to make sure that all the people who are going to be having an influence on the promotion and tenure are aware of what it is that you're doing and how you're being successful. And how have the expectations and requirements for promotion and tenure changed over my career? And before coming into Extension, I had previously worked for 10 years in teaching and research. And so in my personal situation, I achieved tenure and promotion to associate professor at one institution, and then I changed to institutions and I gave tenure up and had to win it back again in my second institution. The first time it was as a teaching professor, the second time was as an extension professor. So I've had that interesting contrast. That was years ago, actually decades ago. Today, I would say over the years, if anything, the requirements and the expectations have just increased. It's more difficult for young people today coming into the profession to achieve success. The standards have moved up pretty much across the board in terms of numbers of publications, amount of external funding brought in. Back in my day, it was perfectly fine to say, gee, I did 25 extension programs this year. Today, we expect more than that. We not only expect the productivity, the programs, but we want to know what happened as a result of it. So when I first started, nobody talked about impact analysis. But today, you know, having impacts, being able to demonstrate impacts and have a good, clear evaluation data is really important. And that's something that I think has evolved over the years. So yeah, the bar has gotten higher, I would say, over the course of my career. Certainly it's more difficult. When I look at the promotion package that I stood up on way back when I became tenured and what is expected today, there's clearly a difference.
My area is environmental education, which is a handy way to connect to extension because my area of expertise is program development and evaluation. So there's a very comfortable extension of my work into extension. In terms of advice, my director told me in my first year of working at the University of Florida that the most important thing I could do was to go to the extension conference that we have every year that brings all the extension agents and specialists together. And part of what he meant was you need to interact with agents. You need to find out what they do, what they need. You need to develop friendships and associations. They need to know you, and that's the secret to extension success. So that also means a needs assessment, being out there, making sure they know what area I can help them with. So they shouldn't call me to identify trees. They should call me to think about 4-H programs or something like that. So I did. I started with the needs assessment. I had a whole laundry list of things I thought they might want and asked them how important they would be or how interested they would be in those kinds of activities. And that directed the first 5 years of my work. I needed to work on the 4-H project books. I needed to work on citizen science activities, update the contests that we have, and that kept me busy for a good long time. The other thing that I think was really useful that I stumbled into was because I had a split appointment, I started off with extension and teaching. And so what I tried to do was blend those two things together. Now that I'm doing extension teaching and research, I'm trying to blend them all in various combinations. So that means if I have an extension program, I think about using a master's student to develop a needs assessment, which can be a thesis and a research paper, if I do it right. When it's teaching, I had a bunch of undergrads research ways we use trees in various and interesting products, and then we all made an extension fact sheet out of it. There's other ways that I've also tried to blend things together. When I was working on curriculum development, I had a bunch of students develop activities, and then the next year they evaluated activities. They've evaluated websites. They've helped develop websites because younger people have a way more facile ability with website software than I ever will. When it comes to website designs, I was really to put our curriculum on the website and make it available. I had no idea that people could develop web tools to do as many things as we ended up doing. So it wasn't just an online training where it was what I would have done in person made available on the web. It was a whole new world of videos and options and pull down menus and crazy things that I never would have thought about. But you hire younger people and away they go.
How would you recommend like a new extension specialist who might be based on campus technically kind of integrate with agents and meet agents and everything, or work with them?
I think you got to get out. You can't sit in the office. You got to interact with them. You got to spend time out there. You got to really understand, because especially Ohio's so diverse in the landscape, and we've got several metropolitan areas, but we've also got Appalachia. And so you can't really assume anything. You've got to spend time there and understand the people and their clients to really be able to have an impact. It's kind of hard to force feed from top down to get things there. If they see the need and it's more bottom up, it's usually more effective.
All right, so here are our perspectives today. And I'll let these people talk, don't worry. Lisa, she's a county agent. She did spend 10 years, or Lisa, why don't you explain who you are?
Okay. Actually, it's been about 12 years total that I was non-tenure track with the University of Florida. And in the last few months, I've actually moved to tenure track. So I have a perspective on both sides of scholarship, whether it's tenure or non-tenure.
Great. Mark?
And I'm Mark McGillis at NC State University. I have returned back to Extension the last 12 or 13 years and have gone through the progression from associate to assistant, Extension associate first, and then got on a professionally ranked non-tenure tracked, and I've gone through the assistant associate and last year to the full professor. So that'll be my perspective today. All the fun of tenure system with none of the tenure benefits.
Andy?
I'm Andy Londo. I started my career nearly 20 years ago as an extension specialist in the forestry department at Mississippi State. And there I was non-tenured. I was an assistant professor, worked my way up to full, but wasn't tenured. Now I'm an administrator at Ohio State and I'm tenured. And so I can, give maybe some perspective on this whole issue from, the administrative side and from, being, a schlub working his way up the ladder.
Thanks. And I'm the host, and I won't be doing too much of the joining in the discussion, but some today. But just as an introduction, I'm an associate professor, an extension specialist. It's a non-tenure track position. I've been in extension for 23 years, starting off as Mark as an extension associate in a non-tenured position. Then I had moved into a county agent position that was a tenured position, tenure track position, but left that to move to a non-tenure track position. And I've got interesting reasons for why I chose not to do tenure track positions. But as Mark said, still all the fun of tenure and promotion without any of the benefits in the long run. But nonetheless, scholarship is still an expectation. So thank you to all of these folks. Now, the way that we've designed this is, could you advance the slide, Leslie? Is we have a series of questions. These are discussion questions that we're going to throw open to the panelists. And these are just to get the conversation started. We may jump around a little bit, but this is intended to be more of an organic kind of a conversation, what people have learned and what was helpful in them achieving scholarship. So this is the first one. As we know, scholarship is very different at each institution, which is why this one has been a challenge to put together this module. And I wanted to know what some of the things that these folks learned that were helpful in achieving their levels of scholarships. And there's going to be, I know, a lot of things, but some of the things that we talked about was how do you define scholarship, working with your colleagues, and then dealing with the department versus college versus university standards, which may all be different, or they might all be the same. So I will let the group take it away. Whoever would like to go first.
Are y'all going to say ladies first?
Yeah, go for it, Lisa.
At least this
Absolutely.
time.
Okay. To me, scholarship is a little bit different at an extension level because I look at it as it's a way of me meeting the needs of my targeted audience. And sometimes that audience could be my colleagues, but it's meeting their needs in some kind of an educational output. How do I put together that information? And then in the end, how do I utilize research and come up with some kind of a scholarly work that I can then use through the promotion process? So it starts from like a needs assessment of my community to then at the end coming up with some kind of a publication that is considered a scholarly work. I think it's really important that it's in whether my audience is, right now I work with small farms and large farm operations, or whether that audience is colleague, the process is very much the same in both levels. I think it is really important working with colleagues because as we go through the tenure process, it is very important and there is an expectation that you are working with your colleagues in your own area of discipline as well as other areas of discipline.
And I can follow up with that from my perspective. I have been back with our department here for the last 12 some odd years, starting as an extension associate where that differentiation in the roles is based on primarily your experience and your final degree as to whether you're an extension associate or the professor role. Since I've been back, they've really defined 3 classes of professors. They wouldn't call them classes, but categories, I would say. The typical research tenured professor. We do have a slot now for teaching professors. So they too would likely be non-tenure tracked, but the emphasis would be on teaching. And then we're discussing today the extension role is that same progression. And we have both tenured and non-tenure track positions. I think depending on the role and the amount of service that one does, a non-tenure track position offers a lot more flexibility in terms of doing the service, doing the programming without necessarily have to chase research dollars, support graduate students, or do the peer-reviewed publication to the degree that the tenure track faculty would. So in going through the process, you have to know how your peers are going to define scholarship. So I went and looked back at the list today, and there are 3 separate types of hurdles. There's a departmental process. You're voted on there. Assuming you move on, you're voted again on a college level. And then at the end of some 6-month discussion period, all of those approved folks move on up to the provost level where they're approved or the like. But at the department level, there's a list of 17, it's not 17 items how they define scholarship can be innovation, superior performance, awards of excellence, and then the classic 4 or 5 metrics that everyone looks at. How much money have you raised? How many peer-reviewed publications or papers or books or proceedings have you been a part of? And then we get more into the extension level presentations that were made. Of that 17 that I'm listing briefly, 5 of them focus on leadership. So there's an expectation that at the assistant level, you'll be known for your work within the state at the associate level within the state and a regionally recognized expert. And then ultimately a full professor, their expectation is national and international acclaim of some sort or another. So they're pretty high hurdles that they're looking for, but how you compile and how you train the people, or not train, but educate the people on what extension is within your departments is a big determination of how you go forward. At the end of the list, there are a lot of the things that we do fairly well. Collaboration, mentoring of those beneath us, you know, undergraduates, graduate students, peers, as in postdocs, and then colleague type folks. So it's not an exhaustive list, but it gives you a place to start. And I would encourage, as the video that you didn't get to see, Jim Johnson really says to dig in deep as to what the metrics are in your division, department, who the peers are that vote on you. We have 60 plus faculty here, but about 25 or 30 of them are the actual voting faculty. So they need to know about what you do. And the scholarship, getting back to Lisa's comments, it's about what you can prove that you've impacted or innovated. And that's where a lot of the creativity comes into play. The last module that this group talked about was evaluation, and having the numbers and the proof of what you've done, whether it's counting people in seats or the more impressive dollars saved or income received as a result of your programs. But that's a place to start. I'll let Andy go from here.
Yeah, Andy's shaking his head there.
Well, I agree with, you know, what Lisa and Mark have said. It's, you know, I was fortunate when I started at Mississippi State. I had a department chair who really valued extension. And, you know, he told me in kind of vague terms, he goes, I don't care. He goes, you're just one of my faculty members, and I'll evaluate you based on, you know, what you're supposed to do and then how well you do it. I was like, well, okay, there's the first hurdle. I've gotten over that. I know, you know, I have to live up to my position description. Okay, great. So I ended up talking to one of my colleagues, and he was teaching research faculty, who's actually moved on and is now a provost at another university. The guy was really smart, great to work with. He was my interim chair for a while. But he says, you know, he goes, it really doesn't matter. He goes, my advice to you is publish everywhere you can. You know, he goes, of course, the department committee and the college committee and all those people are going to look at peer-reviewed articles and conference proceedings and all those kind of things. But, you know, scholarship also includes things like, you know, trade magazine articles. I have a couple dozen of those. You know, maybe not so much newspaper articles, but there's other kinds of scholarship that we do. Curriculum development is certainly scholarship. You know, the grants, you know, securing grants is always something that the E&T committees are going to look at as a measure of scholarship productivity. So I think my advice would be to look at it in the broadest terms that you can, because there's all kinds of things that'll count, if you will. And the more opportunities another way to put it is, you know, the more boxes in your CV that you can fill up, you know, the more check marks you can make is the heavier, the more meat that's going to be in your dossier when you ultimately submit it. But the issue isn't so much at the department level as it is, as I've discovered, at the college level. And I've experienced that here at Ohio State, where we have an extension. I've served on both. In fact, I still serve on my department's P&T committee, and I've served on the college P&T committee. And the department committee, because we're not an academic department, so we have other kinds of issues that we don't need to get into here. But I've been working to make sure that our faculty are beefing up their scholarship, especially on the peer-reviewed side. We have curricula and the you know, conference proceedings and those kind of things in spades. The peer-reviewed stuff is important as well, and just to have it, at least a little bit of it every year, I think is important. Looking at it from my college committee's perspective, they don't get extension. They don't get us. Teaching and research they get. So I think, and I almost hate to say this, but I almost want to say, almost regardless, I think, of where you are, if you have to go through a college committee as well, you need to have some of the scholarship that they're used to seeing. And that includes the journal articles, the dollars brought in, those kind of issues are things that the college committee is really going to be looking at. I know they do here.
Any other thoughts on this one?
I had one more thought, or actually a couple more thoughts, because part of this is how we are, what we've learned, some lessons that we've learned. And I think that I have two lessons that kind of stand out, is to really start early in your career to get to know who is within your discipline that you can maybe start collaborating with, and then try to work on projects or research together, and try not to just stick within your own state, to actually go across those state borders and attend conferences, start networking as soon as you can, just so that as you start going through that tenure or promotion process, you have something in there that shows that you are collaborating and working outside of your bubble. You're getting outside and trying to get to know other people and collaborate with them, have partnerships with other people within your discipline and then outside of your discipline.
I want to just add something to that, as well as Andy's comments earlier and Mark's as well. And it's important to that if you're working out in the state, out in the county, a county somewhere, and not on campus, how can you develop those relationships with your fellow colleagues in the department or college that are on campus, so that they know who you are, and they know what you do, and how can you develop maybe projects or things that you might be able to do with that on-campus faculty. Is that an important component? And I mean, because it's all in who you know, right? And so if you come up for a promotion or tenure, the people sitting around a table, the more they know about you, the better, correct?
So I would agree with that. I think document what you've been doing. Work or influence the people above you as well as below you. Let them know what you're doing. Self-promotion is maybe frowned upon in the extension world, but it's critical for promotion, and letting folks know about that is important. And knowing the folks who are going to vote on your on your life and longevity here. So I think that's important. Being, as Andy said, publish everywhere you can. You'll find a category in a box to put it in ultimately, but I think that does lots to prove, not just fatten up a resume or a CV, but it just helps add weight to your argument that you are tops and you are worthy.
Yeah, I agree. And I like the idea too of, knowing who, every place does this different. Some departments have an elected committee. Many are committees of the whole. It's much easier if it's an elected committee to get to know who those committee members are and visit with them, get to know them. I think that's important. So they, you have that a little bit of a relationship. So you're just not this virtual stranger coming up. But on a little bit of an extended note, and I apologize if I'm straying too far, but if the committee, if your department committee is suggesting you do A, B, and C, I highly recommend that you do A, B, and C, unless you have really good reasons not to. I've seen it happen both at Mississippi State and here, where we're telling faculty, you got to do this. And they're like, hell no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do what I want to do. Well, that's not going to go over well.
Right.
One of the things, and I really hate to say it this way, but you want when your information comes up to the P&T committee and they look at it, you want them to think warm, fuzzy thoughts. You don't want them to think, oh, I remember last year time 2 years ago, and this miserable so and so wouldn't do what we told them to do. It's not so much an ego thing with the committee as it is, we're trying to help you out. If you're not going to take the help, it's almost, well, then to heck with it.
I think it's also important to note the importance of a department head also knowing what you do and who you are. I have seen situations where county agents may be associated with departments, but they're not on campus very much, and the department heads don't know a thing about what's going on. And so there's an ally and there's a potential support that can be very important.
And to make sure you take that advice as it was intended. I know when I was first hired here from a county agent millions of years ago, the department head said, you're going to have to prove that the value of this position. You're going to have a trail of tears, as Andy talked about, a publication list that's yours. It may have been, as Lisa said, collaboratively done with a number of people, but make sure you're the key person that they can look to. And in one sense, you're trying to make yourself indispensable. And if you do that, I think you always have a job, whether it's just a reappointment every 12 months. But if you can do what you do better than others and you can prove it with documentation, people know about it, I don't think you have to fear this process. It's actually an educational opportunity to share what extension is and open up some eyes. I've seen just over time some of the, I wouldn't say the opposition, but the folks who didn't understand what we do now see the true value of extension and are some of our bigger supporters.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I like that. Don't fear the process is a good one. Let's move on to the next question. And some of these were actually kind of brought up a little bit, or at least potential barriers, but I guess I'm asking more sort of institutional, not necessarily just institutional barriers that you've come up against in these processes or have heard about people coming up against. How do you maneuver through those? And we have talked a little bit about these kinds of things already.
Okay, I'll jump in. No, wait, Andy, do you want to go?
Ladies first, Lisa.
Okay. I look at it as two different levels of barriers, one being at a local level and then two being at the state level. The local level, I indicated earlier that I just started the tenure process, and I need to do a needs assessment of my community just to see what they want, because the position that I moved into is now a sustainable food systems position versus before it was working 100% with large-scale vegetable farmers. So there is a whole new audience that's being brought into this, and I need to start working on that needs assessment. That's a huge process because you need to go through the internal review board to make sure that when you're making up that needs assessment, you are capturing information that later on can be reported upon correctly. And then, so that's more of a local, like, how do I go through that process? How do I train myself in the internal review board to make sure that I'm doing it correctly and not repeating a process for the needs assessment? And then at the state level, at the university level, one of the daunting processes of coming up with a publication, extension agents really work at a more local level of fact sheets. But as you go through that tenure process, you now have to look at creative works that are the peer review at a much higher caliber than a local level. And I see that process very daunting. And I'm going to have to learn how that process goes so that I don't feel the way I feel right now. I feel like, how am I going to do this? So you guys are scaring the death out of me of the things you're saying.
Don't fear the reaper, Lisa.
Exactly. I'm hearing you.
That was not my intention. I think I wouldn't think them as barriers, more as challenges that we have to get the extension scholarly notion out there that what we do is relevant. We're changing lives at one level. We may be innovating or improving existing curriculum. We may be diversifying our audience base. Something that we're doing that's new, hopefully that's needs-based, as you mentioned, Lisa. Knowing those institutional hurdles, I think nowadays as we look at more splits, either dual research and teaching or research, teaching, and extension, our new faculty are coming in. Some of those barriers are being reduced by offering of a mentor committee, especially as our staff has gotten more diverse. That mentor committee should reflect the diversity of the faculty we're hiring. So there's an understanding early on that there's really no free time for a new professor. There's the 6 month or agent, 6 month get adjusted, learn the ropes. But during that time, you can't be spinning your wheels. You have to be moving towards some evidence that you need to be there and you have a program there. I think maneuvering through that again is finding the right people to either emulate, be coached by, or model your behaviors, especially if they're the ones that will be reviewing what's going on. So there's education related to it. If you're creating apps for mobile phone use, that may be wholly new and different to the committee who's judging you. So there's the ability to create or document impacts, whether it be page views or downloads or publication. Folks who are actually reading the whole thing, time spent on a page. There are many easier ways to document things. And as we talk to survivors who've been around a while and have learned the system, figuring out a way to evaluate programs, even in an innovative way, I think those go a long way. And then documenting from day one.
So Andy, I think you probably have a good perspective on this.
Yeah, I want to
piece
start
as well.
on with some comments on what Lisa said. Her situation is similar to what we don't have agents here. We call them county educators, but it's the same. You know, they do the same job, and they can move from a professional track into a faculty track. And the biggest problem that my educators have is getting that right, that little bit of extra writing done. Because in order for them to move up to the faculty track, they already have to prove that, you know, they're excellent teachers and they're doing the service and all of that. It's that next step once you're a faculty member of doing the writing. And what I hear, the excuse I hear is that, well, I have, you know, that's not part of my job. Well, yeah, it is. It is part of your job because you just decided to make it part of your job when you moved into the faculty track. And it's not like, you know, our expectations are not that, you know, my educators are going to be publishing in Nature and in Science and all this kind of stuff. That's just not going to happen. You know, and so that's one issue is there's this mental block of, well, I don't have time to write because I got to go out and teach something. The other issue we have, and it's not, again, not so much an institutional barrier as it is more of a cultural barrier, if you will. You know, I'm in ag and natural resources, and so research for us is traditionally field plots, or you're doing studies on wildlife or something of that nature. And you have to have a couple of years of data and on and on and on. And that bogs down my educators thinking, I can't do that. I don't have time to do that. And of course they don't have time to do that. But getting them to realize that there's lots of other things that they can write about. They can look at the needs assessment data, which Lisa talked about. If you do it right, you can get a Journal of Extension article out of it. And hey, that's fully peer reviewed. In fact, it's pretty tough to get through Joe. So, you know, that's one thing. You do new teaching methods, or you have, you know, you change the way you do a program or a field day, and you have evaluations from when you did it the old way. You have evaluations from the new way. Oh my God, you have a Journal of Extension article. So, you know, there's lots of other things you can look at for publishing, especially in a peer-reviewed outlet, than just the traditional. And again, ag and natural resources, and looking at field plots and long-term studies and multiple years of data and graduate students and all this stuff. If you can hook up with and work with a specialist, or if you're a specialist, you can hook up and work with the county educators in those kind of positions, that can be mutually beneficial. You can help get some plots done. You can collect the data. You can include the agent in on the writing. Life is good. Life's good for both of you. So if those of you on the call, if you're one of those folks that are in a county extension office, I do like what Mark said and find out who the specialists are or the folks on campus that are doing work you're interested in, and discuss things with them and try to partner with them. It's just not going to happen. You know, you got to have that relationship first, just like knowing who the committee members are, making them feel warm, fuzzy thoughts about you. You want these specialists to know who you are as well. If they don't know, they're not going to work with you. Conversely, if you're a specialist wanting to work with the counties, you got to know them. You got to have that relationship, or it's just not going to happen. You know, again, not so much an institutional barrier per se, but very much a cultural barrier.
Yeah, so that's something that was mentioned in the video that we didn't get a chance to see by both Martha Monroe and David Apsley, and Jim Johnson as well. Was David and Martha, coming from a specialist perspective, the importance of them getting to know the agents out in the field. What do they need? How can they help them? What can they do together? Both of them talked at length about how important that component is. But Andy, you're kind of moving us into a little bit into the next question or thought. Leslie, if you could move forward. And it doesn't mean that we can't continue to talk about barriers, but this was a question that has come up before, is can you have scholarship without research? Traditionally, right, it's been research. Something that I'll just throw in there for us to maybe think about as well when we're talking about this question is a comment that Jim Johnson made in the video, which is, from his perspective, and he's been in it for 30 some odd years, it's a lot more difficult now to get promotion and tenure than it was when he started. And and it doesn't look like it's going to necessarily get any easier. What role does research have to play in that? Is that still the standard by which, and I know, Andy, you were talking about a lot of different ways what scholarship looks like, but I guess you brought this up a little earlier, so let's continue with this point.
Okay. It's something I actually had to do to some extent when I started at Mississippi State as a faculty member. You know, I was 80-20 extension and research and a civiculturist, and we already had 3 civiculturists on staff. One that did genetics, one that did pine, one that did hardwoods, and they didn't necessarily work and play well with others. And so I had to kind of develop my own ways of finding material to publish. I did it through, in part needs assessments. In fact, we did a needs assessment off of the first interactive video short course we did. And I didn't even do the program. I just asked the person who did the program, hey, can we add a few questions to the end of this just to see how folks like it? Would they see another program, whatnot? And that ended up being published in the Journal of Extension. I had another project, an extension project that I had funded talking about forestry best management practices. And so I did, surveys of my landowners that came to my programs and asking them about what's their knowledge of BMPs. And I was able to I presented that at a national meeting, but then it was accepted for publication in the peer-reviewed proceedings of that meeting. So, again, you don't necessarily need to have plots and, a couple years of data and 3 grad students running around doing things to get information published. You can be creative. And the good thing about today versus when Jim Johnson started way back in the Stone Age. Janine, you can tell Jim I said that. Is there's so many more places to get published in. You know, there's all sort, now they may not all have the same impact factor, which is one of the things that, you know, college committees like to tout, but there's all kinds of perfectly valid peer-reviewed places you can get published in. One more example, a request for papers came out for some pseudo online journal about water quality issues. And so I wrote a paper for Ohio's OSU Extension's response to water quality in the Western Lake Erie Basin. You remember a few years ago, the Toledo water system shut down because of the algal blooms in the lake. And so, you know, I wrote a paper along with a number of couple of my specialists, a bunch of county educators. We're all co-authors, and we got it published. Didn't do any research. I just summed up some of the work we'd already been doing. And so there's lots of ways you can get creative about getting some of this peer-reviewed work done. And I have other examples, especially from when I started at Mississippi State, of ways you can get these kind of publications and materials without having to do all the plot work. You just got to be a little open-minded and be creative and select which outlet you want to send it to.
And so a few of those ideas were kicked around with by Robert Barden when they did the evaluation a module back. Even with online webinars, there's an easy documentation of impact there. And he went through that whole process. But I would encourage folks to think about the impacts of their program as being valuable evidence of scholarship. So that could be the design or redesign as a program, as Angie mentioned, the improvement of a process or the empowerment of people. How do you catch those metrics? I mean, even in small group work, some of those impacts are great. The dollar savings suggest impacts, but also a scholarship of one sort. And it might not always be dollars that we're saving. We could be saving soil or species richness by doing something the right way, the BMPs and the like. And other times, as Andy was mentioning, someone else is collecting the data, but you have the opportunity to present it in a new way. And one of the things I've seen over the last 2 decades is the welcoming of social scientists on our faculty. And Extension should be really closely connected with those folks, because that's the kind of research or applied research that we do. You know, how are we changing people, and what is this intervention doing within the community relative to dropout rates, relative to staying in high school, dropout rates, that kind of stuff. So
Yeah, speaking as a social scientist, it's nice to see that.
it is, and soon those folks will be in power, at least to decide the fate of tenure track faculty and non-tenure track, and so speaking their language is helpful. So that's not trying to be too tongue-in-cheek there, but there are ways of proving scholarship without that.
Yeah, and Mark, if I can add one more thing to that, you had talked about evaluations, and if Jim Johnson were on the call, I'm sure he would state this as well, that increasingly, maybe not even so much the internal folks as it is the external reviewers are looking for more intermediate and longer term impacts of your work. And that is certainly research, and it is certainly scholarship, it's extension scholarship, but it's something that external reviewers are looking at. I know it was looked at for my dossier when I went up for full professor at Mississippi State, and then again when I came here to Ohio State, the reviewers said, well, you need more information on those intermediate and longer term results. Extension does a really good job of that short term. Right at the end of a program, I had X number of landowners, they own this many acres, and they said that I was saving them this much per acre. Life is good. And that's great, and that's useful information, but we need, 6 months to a year out, talk to these folks again. Did you really do what you said you were going to do? or did you really do anything that you learned, and how much did it, how much has it helped? And so I think that's, something that you all need to keep in mind, especially as you get closer to that tenure time. I'm not so sure it's as critical for a county agent or educator, Lisa, but I think certainly for campus-based faculty, or even if you're based at a research and extension center or other remote site, I think it's going to be important for you.
I think at a county level, what's interesting what the University of Florida is doing now is they're actually having a process for extension agents who work on an important document for their community, which might be a local fact sheet. And they're working on a process to allow us to go through the same type of peer review publication to get some of our direct and information into something that can be shared by others, specifically from the needs assessment. If we are being told from our groups, hey, we really need this, and then we turn around and we do a program that meets that needs, now you have a direct impact that you can now turn around, and whether it's a local level or at the next level of peer review, the university is putting that process in place because extension agents have been pretty much excluded from that peer review process. Not totally, but this is opening up a door for more extension agents because of that tenure process and having to have peer review documents.
I think along those lines, more and more extension is being asked to provide that insight stream from the people who need their research questions answered, and being the intermediary to the researchers here on campus. So there's a chance to really prove scholarship by getting a community group together or experts together and bubbling up those research needs to the university.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's scholarship front and center. And then getting back to a couple of the newest extension faculty we've hired who may have 30% appointment and extension, they're always looking at each project from what fact sheet can come from this from the extension side, what research paper can come from this, and then what kind of impacts can I collect while doing my job across all of those. So what do I bring to the classroom from this experience? What stays in the literature, and then documenting what's going on. So I think looking at someone with a multiple split like that, you see some of the most efficient time users, and they're figuring out from day one how to make that all work, and also allowing time for their own mental health and physical health.
Yeah, and one of those people is Martha Monroe, and she's supplying some good comments in the chat box, especially regarding her extension teaching research split, which can be challenging. One thing that's interesting to me with this conversation here around this topic is that you've all brought up things that kind of came before in this module. There's elements of talking about needs assessments. Andy, basically what you were talking about, and Mark as well, is the impacts, the logic model, using all of those things that this whole series has started. This can, in some ways, is kind of the culmination of all of those things that you need to have in place, right, for a good program. And I just wanted to kind of comment on that. I think that that's kind of one of the take-home messages here. Let's see, we've got 10 minutes left. Mark, I see that the sun has come out there in North Carolina. Does anybody have any things you want to kind of say that you didn't get a chance to say? We've got kind of a follow-up ending kind of a slide, but there's a whole lot more we could talk about in addition, but. Anything that anybody feels they need to bring up?
I'll just bring out one comment about and it has to do with research or not in the whole scholarship and as far as barriers. And one of the things that I can recommend to somebody that's starting new in this process, and we've touched on this, but it is so important to really learn who are those researchers. So this is going both ways. Andy and Mark mentioned how maybe answering to what our needs are, but also for an extension agent to turn around and say, who's my researcher? Let me get to know them and see what I can do. If I know, especially, there's something in my needs assessment that I can tie into this. And for an example, recently, since I'm new to sustainable food systems, is I actually went to our vegetable research center and made an introduction, got to know the different researchers. And I haven't been through them all because it's everything from pathology to the entomology, but I got in touch with them and said, here's some of the things through needs assessment that I hear my group want. Can we, if we have an opportunity, let's work together. So this is 2 months into the position, and I'm already reaching out to some of these crucial players just to say, I want to work together with you. So one of my, so some of that could be a barrier is figuring out who it is, but once you get past that, figuring out who it is to really get in touch with them early into your career and try to figure out how the two of you can collaborate.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to add to what Mark said a little earlier about, getting, on research projects and things is that you can also, get those, and I'm going to call this double dipping, which it kind of is, but it's kind of not. If you get research publications, there's no reason you can't take and translate that into, if it's appropriate, into a extension publication or into extension scholarly materials, be it a publication, presentation, part of a curriculum. Again, that's a quick and easy way to get, some scholarship and to kind of, you get the peer-reviewed article out of it. You may get, an extension publication or two out of it, and pretty soon in the grand accounting scheme, that all starts to add up.
Right, I agree.
And I think if we could have heard Martha on the video, all those things in the chat would have come through.
Yeah.
But the idea is figuring out how to work smarter, and I wouldn't taint it with the double dipping notion, because I think those are two different product streams. You may have another researcher who creates the research publication and you're translating it. That's a valuable service, and it's very hard to get it done. The researchers have a way about them in terms of writing and what the expectations are to get published. But figuring out how to distill that is really, it's as much a science as an art. And I think as extensionists, more and more grant makers are looking for that component. And it provides an opportunity, even with a split appointment, to show your extension credibility and be very productive.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to look at that my impact factor, which Andy mentioned earlier, is not the one published by the periodicals themselves or the groups that rank them, but it's about readership and did we impart changes on the ground. And I think our fact sheets can do that. And Lisa, I think where you work is where the rubber hits the road and where those changes are most evident.
Yeah.
And that's because you have the relationships we only dream of being at the university level. And so I think most of us could look back to our local times as being the most fruitful.
Yeah. Are there questions at all? I know we've only got 5 minutes, and I apologize for not leaving a lot of time, but I do know there are some people that are out there, and I don't know if anyone has any questions at all. Can we move on to the next slide while we're kind of... So we've talked about a lot of different ways of what scholarship might look like for depending on your position, where you are, et cetera. But there are some commonalities in terms of whether you're a tenure track, non-tenure, agent, regional, statewide specialist, that I think the content team, we kind of came up with thinking these are pretty common. You know, this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but one of the most important things is to understand the criteria for this in your specific circumstance and at your institution, because it is going to be different everywhere you go. It's one thing that we've certainly realized. Mark brought this up, finding the right mentor or mentors to help you through the process. Being very strategic about how you build a program, and the importance of those logic models and being able to track those outcomes, and being flexible, you know, impacts and long-term, short-term, all that good stuff. I think one of the biggest messages that came out of this is get the most scholarship out of everything you do. Everything that you do has an opportunity for a scholarship. Like Andy was saying, you do a workshop, you write up a thing on the workshop, you put it in, you know, Trade Magazine or something. Everything that you do, you have that opportunity. Something that we did kind of touch on, but something that this is another thing that Martha Monroe, who really stressed in her in the video that we didn't get a chance to see, but I hope all of you check it out. Develop annual reportable items. Every year, have something that can be reportable. They go into making up a larger portfolio of your work. So look at it as not being one-off. Okay, this workshop's over. Now let's do this. You know, it's all building upon on itself to make a large portfolio of your work. And role of your peer recognition. I mean, it's not just publications and awards, but it's important that for tenure and promotion, that you are recognized by your peers, and that is shown to be something that is part of your portfolio, dossier, whatever. You work with colleagues, you publish things. That's a way for your peers to recognize you. Awards and those kinds of things, like through ANREP, those are also very good ways to do that. I think we're running out of time. I've went on and on here at the end. Anybody want to say anything at the for the good of the order?
I'll just repeat what I put in the chat box. When you're reading those bullets, I said to brand what you do and own it, so it could be tracked back to you. And then reiterating what you said, but spelling it wrong, is to squeeze them everything for all it's worth.
Yeah.
And I think that therein lies some of the secret. And the ability to publish has gotten easier and easier in some regards, echoing what Andy said. And some of it's self-publishing. And I know our organization has moved to digital online. I will put a plug in here for SREF too. Many times a state level publication can go regional and
Right.
get the claim that it needs through peer review. And that's been a wonderful opportunity that I hope Leslie will continue for us.
Yeah.
I think Lisa said it earlier too. You know, the key is to start early. You know, don't wait till you're at year 2 or 3 to start this process, because it may be too late. You know, start early, get that dossier built up, or get that body of work built up. Don't be afraid of it. You know, it's not like the old saying, or like I try to tell my 14-year-old, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Yeah. Yes. Lisa, did you have any final words of wisdom for the? I don't want to put you on the spot, but.
Oh, no. No, I think that's pretty much it. I think that if, depending on what track, if you have a choice, you really have to think of the consequences behind tenure and non-tenure. if I look back, sometimes I say, oh my goodness, why did I choose the tenure track? Because now I must strongly prove myself. And when I was non-tenure, I strongly proved myself, and I probably, wish that I would have held back on some of that stuff. But it gives me a goal, a personal goal, is to really go to that next level. And there is a difference between tenure and non-tenure, and you have to make a good decision to which way you're going.
Yes, I would totally agree. That's very, very good ending note. Thank you so much, everyone. We've just basically scratched the surface on this topic. I think we could all sit around with some beer and wine and jalapeno poppers sometime and really get more in depth into this. This will be available online, Leslie, is that at some point?